نريد لبنان ملتقى وفاق عربي.
Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Yumna Naufal, and these are today's top stories. Maronite Patriarch Shadadai calls on the country's politicians to abide by the Constitution and facilitate the formation of the new cabinet. Syria's army advances in East Aleppo in a devastating assault that has placed it in control of more than half of the former rebel stronghold. And the Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro's ashes reach their final stop in Santiago of Cuba, where he will be laid to rest. Maronite Patriarch Shadadai is calling on the country's politicians to abide by the Constitution and facilitate the formation of the new cabinet. The government must be inclusive, he said, and competent in line with the National Pact and Constitution. He said this in his Sunday Mass sermon, calling on politicians to rise above personal and partisan interests, as well as urging the political and parliamentary blocs to abide by the Constitution and the Ta'if Accord and to facilitate the formation of the government. He also called on them to seek the country's welfare and the rise of the state of law and institutions. Saudi Arabia's King Salman is arrived in the United Arab Emirates. He has begun a regional tour aimed at strengthening relations with 4 neighboring Gulf allies. The visit on Saturday will be followed by stops in Qatar, Bahrain and Kuwait in the days ahead. This is his first Gulf tour since taking power in January of 2015. The 7-state Emirates Federation includes the Mideast commercial hub of Dubai and the oil-rich capital Abu Dhabi. It is the second largest Arab economy after Saudi Arabia. All of the countries Salman is visiting are part of the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council known as GCC. The only member of the Saudi-dominated bloc not included in his tour is Oman, which opposes efforts to form a more formal union among the member states. In Lebanon, the DEFA campaign launched its yearly call for any clothing or any items one can spare. It is taking place as we speak in downtown's Martyrs Square. It began earlier this morning at 10 a.m. local time. The campaign started with different people coming in and donating. It ends at 6 p.m. this evening. Donations are given to the poorest families in Lebanon. The organizers are expecting to surpass the number of families that will benefit from the campaign this year and double last year's number. Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri made an appearance to support the initiative and stressed on the duty and responsibility of Lebanese to give back this time of year. Syria's army is advancing in East Aleppo in a devastating assault that has placed it in control of more than half the former rebel stronghold and sparked a civilian exodus. Tens of thousands of civilians have fled eastern neighborhoods of the battered city since President Bashar al-Assad's regime began its latest offensive in mid-November. Overnight, government troops and allied forces seized the district of Tariq al-Bab, where heavy fighting had raged a day earlier. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, regime forces also secured a zone on Saturday around the road from regime-held West Aleppo to the international airport just east of the city, taking 2 whole districts while fighting continued for a third. The Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro's ashes have reached their final stop in Santiago in Cuba, where he will be laid to rest in the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery. The final leg of his funeral procession traveled the last 120 kilometers between Bayamo and Santiago, which is known as the heroic city for its decisive contributions to the complete and definitive independence of Cuba. A massive ceremony was held in the city's Antonio Macheo Revolution Square, where President Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, addressed a crowd of mourners and dignitaries. He said Fidel never gave up his belief and proved with his actions that Cubans can overcome any difficulties and safeguard the country, as well as rebuild Cuban socialism. Coming up next, part 2 of our exclusive with Will Fitzgibbon, the Panama Leaks paper journalist. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Britain could pay into some EU programs after Brexit, but the government will take back control of its own money and will no longer spend large amounts in Brussels, according to Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Businesses, investors, and opposition lawmakers are clamoring for clarity on the government's negotiating position before it triggers the formal exit procedure from the European Union by the end of March next year.
I've always thought that there were aspects of EU cooperation, and I've said this many times, the Erasmus program, for instance, or Horizon funding, or whatever for research, where actually, and some of these programs don't even involve countries that aren't even in the EU, to be part of that in the future might be a good idea, or certainly would be a good idea if it involves paying in. A crucial thing to understand is that very large sums of money will be coming back to this country, which will be capable of being spent on priorities such as the NHS. That will be one of the outcomes of Brexit. What I've always argued is that the crucial thing about immigration is to build public consent for what is happening, and I think it's only by taking back control that you can do that, and it's only by taking back control you can get the numbers down at all. And then you have to go to people and say, look, you've got to understand, there is a sense in which the sheer desire of the world to come to this country, high-skilled workers, is a massive compliment and tribute to the UK economy. And what I have genuinely found in the last few months is that the mood in amongst our European friends, primarily, but also in the rest of the world, who are all a bit startled by Brexit to begin with.
Yes.
The mood has really changed. What the EU wants to achieve is a partnership, and I think that beneath it all, and there'll be more Sturm and Drang between now and the end of the negotiations, and it may get pretty hairy at times, and there may be some difficult bits, but beneath it all there is a massive fondness for the UK and a desire to do the best possible deal.
After the 5th edition of Free Connected Minds, an annual conference held by the Meishidiat Foundation, we sat down with Will Fitzgibbon, a reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, who conducted the investigation on the Panama Papers and talked about the work and meaning of investigative journalism and WikiLeaks. Here is part 2 of the exclusive. We were discussing earlier at the beginning of the interview, one of the main reasons why you're in Beirut was because you were invited to attend and talk about the Panama Papers at the Free Connected Minds conference, part of the Meishidiat Foundation, its yearly conference. And one of the other panels there that I had the pleasure to conduct was with WikiLeaks co-founder and editor-in-chief Julian Assange, which you attended a little bit. And the night before the panel, it's not out of the ordinary for an interviewer and an interviewee to discuss a few subjects, a few topics. And we were on the phone, and he actually asked what panel was right before the WikiLeaks one, and I said the Panama Papers. And then we started talking, and I know the ICIJ and WikiLeaks don't see eye to eye on how to conduct leakage, as we can say. He says you've been very critical because the ICIJ head, Gerard Ryle, said, "We don't publish," and I quote, "all the documents. We try to give journalism, we try to reclaim ground for journalism. We are the alternative to WikiLeaks out there. This is a different model. We are probably a threat to WikiLeaks, and we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly." So in a way, that is an outright critique to WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks has said, how could they not release everything? Why are they withholding information, whereas WikiLeaks tends to release everything? So are they in competition? Is that what it is? How does that work?
I don't think it's a question of competition. I think
he did say we are the alternative, though.
Right.
The head
and
of the
I think
ICIJ.
this is where journalists are, and indeed where civil society is at this stage when it comes to journalism, and especially to leak-based journalism. We have to remember that leaks have really only been around for, as we know them, since really WikiLeaks 10 years ago.
The Pentagon Papers.
I'm talking in a digital sense.
Oh, right, in recent history.
Exactly,
right.
And therefore I think that journalists are still trying to work out how do we process this information, how do we make sure that we're doing our job as tellers of fact and we're doing it responsibly with all the technical and professional challenges that that entails. And therefore it's not just a binary between WikiLeaks and ICIJ. There's a great debate going on across the globe these days
about how to handle leaks in general.
This kind of information. Absolutely.
Right, but when he says, we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly. I mean, obviously he's, Julian Assange has gotten a lot of heat because of his leaks and because of, not withholding information. But not withholding information is irresponsible because...
I would say that all journalists clearly strive towards responsibility.
But, part of the reason why you are releasing these leaks, the Panama leaks, is for transparency, right? To hold people accountable, to make people aware, everyday people, that this is what's going on in your government, in your country. So how is it different? Because the goal is kind of the same, isn't it? The two goals are the same.
Indeed. Both organisations are interested in transparency. ICIJ and its members made a decision based on the Panama Papers that we were lucky enough to work on, and other decisions will be made by other organisations. The Panama Papers model, for example, is one that very much reflects what we see in government registries across the globe. We released over 200,000 names of shell companies and people associated with those companies, and that we know has been used by governments and is still being used by governments to go after individuals, to go after companies who perhaps have broken laws or avoided taxes.
Well, when people tell you, ICIJ now, one of the headquarters in DC, it has journalists obviously working in different countries, and for it to be working that way, there has to be some form of government approval. When people tell you that, what do you respond to them?
I laugh and remind myself of the fact that probably the very first searches we all made when we had access to Panama Papers were Americans and American politicians and senior American figures, because the holy grail of that, the holy grail for a journalist working in America would be a great American story.
Right, but then if you were to criticize the system, you'd probably get heat for it as well.
I'm sure we would, and I'm sure we would welcome that heat from within the United States. As you said, our model is one of such global newsroom nature that I feel extremely confident in the fact that Panama Papers have been poured over by now over 400 very talented professional journalists.
What's the next thing you're going to work on? Or will we be releasing more papers of tax havens and offshore holdings? And
I think we live in a world, as the whistleblower of Panama Papers says, that is increasingly digitized, and therefore it wouldn't surprise me.
We don't know who he is or who she is or what source. All right.
But I'm not making any promises and I have no information to base this off, but I'd be very surprised if we didn't see more leaks of this kind in the future.
When it comes to tax havens specifically, or different kinds of leaks?
I think all kinds of leaks.
Do you think there's a red line when it comes to leaks? There's some things that just should not be published, some things that should not be put out there?
I think I'd have to make that decision based on the content of the material. But given how widespread the scandals of the offshore industry and the finance industry are, I very much personally am looking forward to doing more of these kinds of investigations, because the problem isn't going away.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
That was Will Fitzgibbon, a reporter for the ICIJ. Thank you for tuning in. This marks the end of our bulletin. Now a reminder of our headlines. Maronite Patriarch Shaddai calls on the country's politicians to abide by the Constitution and facilitate the formation of the new cabinet. Syria's army advances in East Aleppo in a devastating assault that has placed it in control of more than half of the former rebel stronghold. And the Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro's ashes reach their final stop in Santiago of Cuba, where he will be laid to rest in a cemetery. Those are your Sunday headlines live on Future Television. Catch us again tomorrow for all the latest, and have a good week ahead.
نريد لبنان ملتقى وفاق عربي